He forbade his daughter from speaking to the boy from the neighboring ranch, threatened to evict his family, and locked the girl in the house like a prisoner. But her heart had already made its choice, and when true love enters someone's life, there is no gate, no fence, no authoritarian colonel who can stop it. Can you imagine living in a gilded cage, having everything money can buy, but being forbidden to love the only person who makes your heart beat faster? Would you have the courage to defy your own father to follow your heart, knowing it could cost you everything? But this story actually happened in August of 1897, in the deep rural countryside, amidst the rolling hills that separated the Bellevue estate from the Holy Cross Ranch. Before continuing this story, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and leave your like down below, because the ending of this narrative will surprise you in ways you never imagined. What this young woman discovered about her own father's past changed not only her destiny and that of the boy she loved, but completely transformed the lives of two entire families and the whole community around them. And tell me in the comments what city you are watching this story from. I love knowing where these narratives travel and whose hearts they touch. The afternoon of August 17, 1897, fell warm and golden over the undulating fields that separated the two estates, painting the dried grass of late summer with shades of honey and amber. The sky was clear, that intense deep blue that only appears in the highlands when the dry season is ending, without a single cloud to soften the strong glare of the sun slowly descending toward the distant mountains. The air held that characteristic scent of dry earth mixed with the smoke of controlled burns in the pastures, a smell that clung to clothes and hair, the smell of the country, of the land, of rural life, following nature's cycles without haste. Elizabeth Victoria Sterling walked along the narrow trail that cut through the tall pasture, holding her pale blue cotton skirt with one hand to keep it from snagging on the twigs and briars growing at the edge of the path. She had turned 19 in May, of average height for the era, about 5'3", with a slender but strong frame of someone who grew up with good nutrition and daily exercise, even if only walks around the estate grounds. Her light brown hair, almost honey-colored when the sunlight hit it, fell in natural waves to the middle of her back, partially pinned in a loose bun at the nape of her neck, with rebellious strands escaping to frame her oval face. Her skin was fair but not pale, possessing that soft golden tone of someone who spends time outdoors without overexposing themselves to the unforgiving sun. Her eyes were the most striking feature of her face, large and expressive, a hazel green that shifted in hue depending on the light, framed by long, dark lashes. Her nose was straight and delicate, her mouth featuring well-defined lips that naturally curved into a slight smile, even in repose, giving her face an expression of permanent sweetness that perfectly matched her naturally gentle personality. She carried a wicker basket on her left arm, covered with an embroidered white linen cloth. Inside were fresh loaves of bread the cook had baked that morning, a jar of peach preserves she had made herself the previous week, and 3 bottles of fresh milk wrapped in damp cloths to keep them cool. She was taking them to Mrs. Mary Sawyer, the wife of the neighboring ranch's foreman who had given birth 5 days ago and needed help with meals while recovering from a difficult labor. It was a task Elizabeth performed frequently, taking provisions and home remedies to the families of the workers on the surrounding farms, even against the growing and increasingly explicit will of her father. He thought it inappropriate for the daughter of a wealthy landowner to walk through other people's properties as if she were a common maid. But Elizabeth had inherited from her mother, who passed away 7 years ago, that genuine compassion for the less fortunate, that need to help, to alleviate others' suffering when it was within her reach. It was a personality trait her father had never managed to extinguish, despite all his attempts, Elizabeth Victoria had clear and vivid memories of her mother, unlike many children who lose their parents early and are left only with hazy, confused impressions. She was 12 when Julia Sterling died, old enough to have kept not just her mother's image, but entire conversations, lessons, and shared moments etched in her memory like permanent portraits. Julia was a woman of serene beauty, shorter than her husband, with dark hair always pinned in elaborate braids, gentle eyes the same honey color her daughter had inherited, and a soft voice that never needed to be raised to be heard and respected. She came from a family less wealthy than the Sterlings, the daughter of a small merchant from the town of Macon, but she possessed a refined education that her own mother, a primary school teacher, had insisted on providing. She could read, write, do complex arithmetic, spoke a little French she learned from old books, played the piano with considerable skill, and had that natural elegance that comes not from money, but from character. The marriage between Julia and Augustus Sterling had been, surprisingly for the time, for genuine love, and not for social convenience or family arrangement. They met at a summer harvest dance in town. She was 17 and he was 25. Augustus was fascinated by the young woman who wasn't intimidated by his presence, who conversed, looking him in the eye, who laughed with sincerity rather than that affected giggle wealthy girls used to appear delicate. He courted her for 6 months, visiting her home every week, bringing flowers from the estate gardens, talking to her father with genuine respect, despite the difference in social standing. They married in April of 1877, a beautiful ceremony in the main church, a generous reception hosted by Augustus's father, the old Colonel Stephen Sterling, even though he didn't completely approve of his son's choice. The old colonel thought Augustus could have married the daughter of another rich planter to form a powerful alliance, but the young man had fallen in love and wouldn't yield. The first years of the marriage were truly happy, filled with those simple but profound joys that build a solid foundation. Julia transformed the big house of the Bellevue estate, which was handsome but too cold and masculine, into a welcoming home. She planted a rose garden around the veranda, filled the rooms with fresh flowers, opened heavy curtains to let the light in, and brought music with the piano Augustus had ordered especially for her. She cooked recipes she learned from her mother, even though they had a hired cook, because she enjoyed the process, liked to create. She embroidered while Augustus read the newspaper on the porch after dinner. They talked about everything: the farm, politics, books, dreams. Augustus was different back then, Elizabeth remembered vaguely through the eyes of a small child. He smiled more, laughed out loud at silly jokes, grabbed Julia by the waist and spun her around when he was happy, hummed while he worked. He was an affectionate man, present, not ashamed to demonstrate love for his wife even in public, a rare thing among landowners of the time, who usually treated wives with distant formality even when they cared for them. Elizabeth was born in May of 1878, a year and a month after the wedding. The labor was long and difficult, but mother and baby survived well. Augustus wept when he held his daughter for the first time, tears of a hard man who rarely showed emotion, but who, in that moment, couldn't hold back. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by abundant love from both parents. Julia taught her everything she knew from an early age. By 4, Elizabeth recognized the letters of the alphabet. By 6, she read entire books by herself. By 8, she helped her mother with the pantry accounts and the household budget. By 10, she played simple pieces on the piano and embroidered with perfect stitches. Julia wanted her daughter to have every tool possible to be an independent and intelligent woman, even knowing that society at the time severely limited what women could do. "At least she will have knowledge," Julia would say to Augustus when he questioned if it wasn't too much education for a girl. "Knowledge is something no one can take from her, even if they try." But in September of 1890, shortly after Elizabeth had turned 12, tragedy arrived swiftly and devastatingly, like a summer storm. Julia began to feel sharp pains on the right side of her abdomen, pains that came in waves, leaving her pale and sweating. They called the town Dr. Sawyer, no relation to the foreman, a man in his 60s with considerable experience. He examined her, grew serious, and diagnosed acute appendicitis, a severe inflammation of the appendix requiring immediate surgery. But abdominal surgery in 1890 in the rural South was an extremely risky procedure, almost always fatal. There was no adequate hospital nearby, no safe anesthesia, no antibiotics to prevent the inevitable infection. The doctor did what he could right there in the farmhouse, improvising a surgical theatre in the living room, using instruments sterilized in boiling water, administering ether for anesthesia. Augustus held Julia's hand until she lost consciousness, then was sent out by the doctor. The surgery lasted 3 agonizing hours. The doctor managed to remove the inflamed appendix, which was nearly perforated, cleaned the abdominal cavity as best he could, and stitched the layers of tissue with meticulous care. Julia survived the procedure, woke up a few hours later, weak but conscious. Augustus entered the room, saw his wife alive, and felt a relief so intense his legs almost failed him. Julia smiled at him, squeezed his hand, whispered that everything was fine. Elizabeth was allowed in for a few minutes, hugged her mother carefully so as not to hurt her, said she loved her, and heard her mother say the same back with a raspy but firm voice. For 2 days it seemed Julia would recover. She talked, drank broth the cook prepared, complained about being bored in bed. But on the 3rd day, the fever arrived. It started low, then spiked rapidly, turning Julia into a burning body shivering under 3 wool blankets. Infection had set in, a galloping sepsis that the medicine of the time couldn't fight. The doctor returned, tried every remedy he knew, but nothing worked. Julia was delirious with high fever, calling out for people who weren't there, reliving jumbled memories. Augustus didn't leave her bedside, holding her hand, begging her to hold on, to stay. Elizabeth stood at the bedroom door, barred from entering to avoid witnessing the full suffering, but hearing every moan, every labored breath of her mother. In the early hours of the 4th day, Julia had a moment of sudden lucidity. She called for Augustus, asked to see Elizabeth. Her husband brought their daughter, and the two embraced. Julia kissed Elizabeth's forehead, said with a weak but clear voice that she loved her more than anything, that Elizabeth had to be strong, had to continue being the kind and intelligent girl she was. Then she looked at Augustus, asked him to take good care of their daughter, told him not to let the pain turn him into a bitter man. Augustus promised with tears streaming down his face, promised he would do everything she asked. Julia closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and slipped away so gently that for a few seconds no one realized she was gone. The funeral took place the next day in the small cemetery in town, beside the chapel where Julia and Augustus had married 13 years earlier. Half the village attended, because Julia was beloved by all, always kind to poor and rich alike, always willing to help those in need. Elizabeth stood beside her father throughout the ceremony, dressed in black, holding his large, calloused hand, feeling his body shake with silent sobs he tried to contain but couldn't. It was the first and last time Elizabeth saw her father cry openly. After that day, Augustus never shed another tear in front of anyone, never showed vulnerability again. The pain of the loss was so devastating that he did the opposite of what he had promised his wife on her deathbed. Instead of not letting the pain transform him, he let it consume him completely, burning away the gentle version of himself and leaving only the ashes of a hardened, closed-off man. In the 7 years that followed, Augustus Sterling transformed into someone Julia wouldn't recognize. The affectionate man who smiled and hugged disappeared completely, replaced by a rigid authoritarian colonel who governed the estate with an iron fist and treated everyone, including his own daughter, with formal and cold distance. He stopped playing the piano he had bought for Julia, ordered the instrument covered with a white sheet, and never allowed anyone to touch it again. He stopped planting flowers, letting the rose garden Julia loved so much dry up and die little by little. He kept the windows open only in the morning to air out the rooms, then closed everything, returning the house to the gloom it had before. He spoke only when strictly necessary, answering questions with monosyllables or short phrases. He ate alone in his study instead of at the dining table where he used to sit with Julia. He slept little, spending nights awake in his office, working on ledgers, or simply sitting in his chair staring into the void. With Elizabeth, he developed a strange and suffocating relationship. He loved his daughter. That was obvious by the way he ensured she had everything she needed. Beautiful clothes, plentiful food, private tutors to continue the education Julia had started. But at the same time, he had a sickly fear of losing her as he had lost his wife. This fear transformed him into an overprotective jailer. When Elizabeth was 15 and began to receive attention from young men in town during Sunday services, Augustus simply stopped taking her to church. He said it was dangerous, that she could catch diseases, that bad people frequented the place. When Elizabeth was invited to a birthday party for the daughter of another landowner at 16, Augustus refused permission. Parties were places of improper behavior, he said. Decent young ladies didn't need social distractions. When Elizabeth expressed a desire to visit her maternal aunt, Aunt Candida, who lived in Macon, Augustus denied it. The journey was too long, he argued. Bad things could happen on the road. Gradually, Elizabeth realized she was being imprisoned in her own home, that her father wouldn't let her have a life of her own because he had a pathological fear that something would happen to her. It was a love diseased and deformed by loss, a love that suffocated instead of liberated. Elizabeth tried to argue a few times, tried to make her father see that she needed freedom, experiences, life beyond the fences of Bellevue Estate. But Augustus always cut the conversation short with a final tone that brooked no argument. "I know what is best for you," he would say. "I already lost your mother. I won't lose you too, because of your carelessness or recklessness. You will obey me. And that's final." The only concession he made was allowing Elizabeth to visit the families of the workers on their own estate, bringing food, home remedies, helping with births, teaching children to read. It was an escape valve that kept Elizabeth minimally sane, gave her a sense of purpose, allowed her to use the education and kindness her mother had cultivated in her. But even these visits began to be questioned by Augustus in recent months. He thought his daughter was mixing too much with the lower class, that she was losing the proper bearing of a wealthy landowner's daughter. It was during one of these visits, 3 months ago, in May of 1897, that Elizabeth saw Michael Anthony Sawyer for the first time in a way that truly mattered. Michael had always existed on the periphery of her consciousness, the son of the neighboring ranch's foreman, Mr. Frank Sawyer, a hard-working and honest man whom Augustus respected professionally. Elizabeth had seen Michael grow from a scrawny 13-year-old boy into a strong young man of 22 during the years of her own adolescence. But she had never really looked at him, never noticed him as an individual until that rainy afternoon in May. Elizabeth was returning from Mrs. Mary's house, who at the time was 7 months pregnant and suffering from painful swelling in her legs when the rain began. It wasn't that gradual rain that gives you time to seek shelter. It was a sudden, violent storm, typical of late spring in the south, pouring icy water as if someone had overturned a giant bucket in the sky. Elizabeth ran looking for cover. her empty basket banging against her leg, her skirt soaking through and becoming heavy, her loose hair plastering against her wet face. She saw the dark shadow of the Holy Cross barn ahead, ran toward it, pushed the heavy wooden door, and stumbled inside, breathing hard, dripping water onto the packed dirt floor. There was someone inside. Michael was mending a horse harness, sitting on a low bench near a stack of dry hay, tools scattered around him. He stood up when he heard the door open, turned and froze, looking at her. Elizabeth also froze. For a few seconds they just looked at each other while the rain drummed on the tin roof, creating a deafening noise that isolated the barn from the rest of the world. Michael was tall, over 5'9", with broad shoulders of someone who has done heavy labor since childhood, his muscular arms exposed because he had rolled the sleeves of his simple raw cotton shirt up to his elbows. His skin was tanned by the constant sun, the color of burnt earth, with small scars here and there from years of working with tools and animals. His face had marked masculine features, a square jaw, a straight, strong nose, well-defined lips. His hair was dark brown, almost black, grown out too long because he lacked the time or money to cut it regularly, falling messily over his forehead and behind his ears. But it was his eyes that held Elizabeth's attention, light hazel eyes, honey-colored like hers, framed by thick lashes, eyes that held a lively intelligence, genuine kindness, and something else she couldn't name in that moment. "Sorry to intrude," Elizabeth said finally, breaking the awkward silence that had settled. "The rain caught me." Michael shook his head, indicating it was no problem. "Make yourself at home," he replied, his voice deep and pleasing to the ear. "This rain isn't stopping any time soon." Elizabeth looked around the barn, searching for somewhere to sit that wasn't the wet, dirty ground. Michael noticed, went to the haystack, grabbed a large armful, took it to the driest corner, and made an improvised seat. "Here's more comfortable," he offered, without looking directly at her, as if he were acutely aware of the difference in their social stations. Elizabeth thanked him and sat down, arranging her soaked skirt that clung uncomfortably to her legs. Michael returned to his bench, picked up the harness and resumed work. But Elizabeth noticed he was tense, his hands not as steady as they should have been, his gaze drifting in her direction every time he thought she wasn't looking. The rain continued for nearly an hour. During the first 20 minutes they sat in silence, only the noise of water on the roof and the occasional sound of Michael's tools filling the space. But gradually, they began to talk. First, it was superficial comments about the weather, about how the dry season was ending early this year, about how the crops would benefit from the water. Then the conversation drifted to more personal subjects. Michael asked if Mrs. Mary was better, demonstrating knowledge of Elizabeth's visits and genuine concern for the neighbors' well-being. Elizabeth told him about the swelling that was decreasing with the teas she prepared, about how the baby was kicking strong and healthy. Michael smiled upon hearing this, a beautiful smile that lit up his whole face and made something strange happen in Elizabeth's chest. A sudden tightness, followed by warmth that spread. She asked about his work, about the horses he trained. Michael spoke with evident passion about the animals, about how each had its own personality, about the patience needed to gain their trust. He had a way of speaking that revealed natural intelligence, keen observation, a sensitivity Elizabeth hadn't expected to find. The conversation flowed with surprising ease, as if they were old friends and not virtually strangers, separated by a social abyss. When the rain finally stopped and Elizabeth stood up to leave, something had changed. She looked at Michael and saw not just the foreman's son, but a real, complex, interesting person. Michael looked at her, and his eyes held hers for a moment too long to be casual. "Thank you for the hospitality," Elizabeth said, her voice coming out softer than she intended. Michael just nodded, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her heart race. She left the barn and walked back home with the strange sensation that something important had happened, though she couldn't define exactly what. In the following days, Elizabeth caught herself thinking about Michael with a frequency that both bothered and fascinated her. She remembered the conversation, the way he explained things about horses with contained passion, the smile that transformed his serious face, the eyes that seemed to see beyond the soaked clothes, and the title of landowner's daughter. She began to look for excuses to pass near the Holy Cross Ranch during her visits to the workers' families. She always carried the basket of provisions, always had a legitimate reason to be on that path, but deep down she knew she was hoping to see Michael again. And she did sometimes. He was training a horse in the corral, or fixing a fence in the pastures, or loading hay into the stable. They exchanged glances. They waved. Sometimes Michael stopped what he was doing and came to the fence that divided the properties just to greet her properly. They talked for a few minutes, always with the safe distance of the fence between them, always about neutral subjects. But there was an invisible electric current connecting them, a tension that grew with every encounter. It was Mrs. Mary, far too perceptive for her own good, who noticed first. One afternoon when Elizabeth was visiting with starch biscuits, the woman looked at her with knowing eyes and asked if there was something going on between her and Michael. Elizabeth turned red instantly, denying it with excessive vehemence that gave away the truth. Mrs. Mary laughed softly, but then grew serious. "Child," she said in a low voice full of genuine worry, "be careful with that. Your father will never accept it. You know that, don't you?" Elizabeth knew, of course she knew, but the heart doesn't obey logic or social hierarchy. The more she tried not to think about Michael, the more he occupied her thoughts. She began to dream of him at night, confused dreams where they talked in impossible flowered fields, where he held her hand, where social barriers didn't exist. Michael was also feeling the same, she discovered one afternoon in July, 2 months after that first meeting in the barn. Elizabeth was returning from visiting the cattleman's family, walking along the shortcut that passed through a small grove of pines planted years ago as a windbreak. She heard a twig snap behind her, turned startled, and saw Michael standing a few yards away. "Eliza!" he called, and there was an urgency in his voice that made her stop. He approached slowly, like someone approaching a frightened animal, stopping at a respectful distance of 3 feet. "I need to say something," he said, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. Elizabeth felt her heart pound, intuiting what was coming, and at the same time daring not to believe it. Michael swallowed hard, gathered his courage. "I know I shouldn't," he began, his voice raspy with contained emotion. "I know you are Colonel Augustus's daughter, and I am just a foreman's son. I know I have no right, but I can't stop thinking about you. Since that day in the barn, you are the only thing in my head. I see you everywhere. I hear your voice when no one is speaking. I dream about you every night, and I needed to tell you, even knowing it's madness, even knowing you'll probably say, 'I'm being forward.'" Elizabeth lost her breath. She literally felt her lungs stop functioning for seconds. Then her breath returned in a deep sigh that came out shaky. "Me too," she whispered, and her voice barely came out. "I can't stop thinking about you either." Michael closed his eyes, as if hearing that caused simultaneous pain and relief. When he opened them again, they shone with intense emotion. "What do we do?" he asked with desperation in his voice. "Your father will never accept it. If he finds out, he'll kick me out, send my father away too, ruin my family." Elizabeth knew he was right. She knew her father well enough to know exactly how he would react. But at the same time, for the first time in 7 years since her mother's death, she felt something stronger than the fear of displeasing her father. She felt something worth taking risks for. "We'll be careful," she replied finally, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. "We'll meet in secret until we find a way to make your father understand." And so it began. Secret meetings in the pine grove, always in the late afternoon, when the sun was descending and the shadows grew long. Conversations that lasted hours, sitting on the dry pine needles, leaning against the fragrant tree trunks. Michael spoke about his dreams, about wanting to own land one day, small but his own, where he could raise horses and live free from dependence on a boss. Elizabeth spoke about her loneliness, about how she felt trapped in the gilded cage her father had built around her. They shared childhood memories, secret fears, fragile hopes, and gradually the feeling that began as confused attraction transformed into something deeper and more frightening. It was love, true love that doesn't ask permission to be born, that ignores social conveniences and grows uncontrolled like a strong weed that no one can uproot. The first touch happened 3 weeks after that confession in the woods. They were sitting on the fallen log that became their favorite bench, talking about something Elizabeth later wouldn't be able to remember. Michael's hand was on the bark of the log next to hers, fingers almost touching, separated by millimeters. Elizabeth looked down, saw the proximity, felt a sudden courage take over. She moved her hand slightly, closing the distance, brushing her fingers against his. Michael froze, turned his head to look at her with an expression of surprise mixed with intense desire. Then, slowly, he turned his hand and interlaced his fingers with hers. They stayed like that, hands joined, looking at each other, feeling the world reduced to that point of contact. It was a simple gesture, just holding hands, but charged with enormous meaning, with promise and danger. It was exactly at that moment, in that second of perfect and forbidden connection, that a branch snapped loudly at the edge of the grove. The two jumped, separating their hands with instinctive guilt. Elizabeth turned and felt the blood freeze in her veins. Her father was standing there, mounted on his large black horse, looking at them with an expression that started as surprise and quickly transformed into a cold, controlled fury that was much more frightening than any shout. Augustus Sterling dismounted with calculated, dangerous movements, tied the reins to a nearby tree, and walked toward the two young people who were paralyzed like rabbits before a predator. "Elizabeth," he said with a low, cutting voice, "you are going back to the house now, immediately." Elizabeth opened her mouth to argue, but her father's expression cut off any words. She looked at Michael, saw panic in his eyes, wanted to say something but couldn't. She stood up slowly, began to walk toward her father's horse. Augustus didn't follow her immediately. Instead, he turned to Michael with a look that promised terrible consequences. "You," he said, with a voice that distilled contempt, "stay away from my daughter. If I see you near her again, I guarantee you and your father will be looking for work in another county. And this whole story, this conversation today, does not leave this spot. Understood?" Michael nodded, but there was defiance in his eyes too, a refusal to bow completely. Augustus saw it, and it made him even more furious. The ride back home was silent and tense. Elizabeth rode in front of her father, held by him with an excessive firmness that hurt her arms. When they arrived at the manor, Augustus practically dragged his daughter inside, went up the stairs, and shoved her into her room. "You are grounded," he declared with absolute coldness. "You will not leave this room except for meals under supervision, and no more visits to anyone. It's over. This phase of misguided kindness is over. Elizabeth, you will obey me, or the consequences will be severe not just for you, but for that boy and his family." He left and locked the door from the outside. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the room, listening to the key turn, feeling the reality of that prison, which was metaphorical, become literal. She walked to the window, looked out at the fields stretching toward the Holy Cross Ranch in the distance, and felt tears finally come. But along with the tears, there was a determination being born, a resolve that her father would not win this time, that her heart had already chosen, and there was no fence, no lock, no threat that would change that. 2 weeks passed since that afternoon in the pine grove when Elizabeth's world collapsed. 2 weeks of almost total confinement in the bedroom that transformed from a comfortable refuge into a suffocating cell. The door remained locked from the outside, the key kept in the pocket of Augustus's vest, which he never removed. 3 times a day, promptly at 7 in the morning, noon, and 7 at night, the maid Teresa, a woman in her 40s with a face marked by time and eyes full of poorly disguised pity, unlocked the door, bringing a tray with food. Elizabeth had 15 minutes to eat under the maid's surveillance, then was locked in again. Her father didn't come to see her. He sent messages through Teresa, short and harsh notes, reminding her that this punishment would continue until Elizabeth demonstrated genuine repentance and promised never to approach the inappropriate boy again. Elizabeth spent the long, empty days looking out the bedroom window that faced the rolling fields, stretching to the misty horizon. The window had no bars because there was never a need before. It was on the 2nd floor, too high to jump without serious injury. She watched the sun rise, painting the sky pink and orange, climb slowly, tinting everything gold, then descend in the late afternoon, creating long shadows that gradually swallowed the landscape. She saw the workers in the distant fields, tiny figures moving between the rows of crops, tending the cattle, mending fences. She searched for Michael among them, but they were too far away to distinguish faces, just shapes that could be anyone. At night, she lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the big house falling asleep around her, her father's footsteps in the hallway, always late, pacing back and forth like a man who couldn't find peace even in sleep. The creaking of the floorboards, the tick-tock of the grandfather clock downstairs marking interminable seconds, the distant hoot of an owl hunting in the fields, the wind moaning through the cracks of the poorly sealed windows. Elizabeth tried to read the books she had in her room, tried to distract herself by diving into stories of other places and other times. But the words slipped past her eyes without fixing their meaning. Her mind constantly wandered to Michael, to the brief touch of hands on the fallen log, to the expression in his eyes when he confessed his feelings, to the fear she saw in those same eyes when her father appeared. Was Michael okay? Had her father carried out the threat to evict the Sawyer family? Did Michael think of her with the same obsessive frequency she thought of him? The questions swirled in her head without answers, creating a constant anguish that tightened her chest and made it hard to breathe properly. She embroidered to pass the time, mechanical stitches her fingers made automatically while her mind was far away. She created an entire garden of red roses on white linen cloth, each petal meticulously detailed, each leaf shaded with varied tones of green. Beautiful work that brought no satisfaction, just occupied restless hands. On the 16th day of confinement, on a September morning when autumn was clearly approaching, with milder temperatures and the first leaves turning, the routine changed. Teresa brought breakfast as usual, but this time she also brought a different message. "Your father says you can leave the room this afternoon," the maid informed her as she placed the tray on the table near the window. "He wants to speak with you in the study at 3 o'clock. There is a visitor arriving." Elizabeth felt a confused mixture of relief at finally leaving that jail and apprehension about what her father wanted. "Who is the visitor?" she asked, but Teresa just shook her head, indicating she didn't know or couldn't say. At 5 minutes to 3, Elizabeth descended the stairs, feeling her legs a bit weak from staying so long without walking properly. She wore a simple moss-green cotton dress her mother had sewn for her years ago, her hair in a single braid falling down her back, her face too pale from being confined away from the sun. Her father's study was on the ground floor, a massive oak door always closed, a room that was male territory where Elizabeth rarely entered. She knocked on the door with her knuckles, 3 light taps. "Come in," came her father's deep voice from inside. Elizabeth opened the door, entered, and paused in surprise to see they weren't alone. Besides Augustus sitting behind the large dark wood desk covered in papers and ledgers, there was another man in the room. He was sitting in the leather armchair facing the desk, and he stood up politely when Elizabeth entered. He was a man in his 30s, tall and well-dressed, in a complete light grey linen suit that was obviously expensive, a brocade vest, a navy blue silk tie, a gold pocket watch chain crossing the vest, polished leather shoes that betrayed comfortable wealth. His dark blonde hair was slicked back with pomade, a thin, trimmed moustache following the urban fashion of the time, light blue eyes examining Elizabeth with an interest she found immediately uncomfortable. "Elizabeth," Augustus said with a formal voice, "this is Dr. Henry Banks, a physician from Macon, graduated from medical school in Richmond. Dr. Banks, my daughter Elizabeth Victoria." The doctor made an elegant bow, took Elizabeth's hand, and kissed it quickly on the back, a gesture that made her skin crawl in an unpleasant way. "An immense pleasure, Miss Elizabeth," he said with a voice that was polite, but with a tone trying to appear charming and managing only to sound rehearsed. "Your father has told me much about you." Elizabeth looked at her father, beginning to understand with growing horror where this was leading. "Dr. Henry is the son of Dr. Arthur Banks," Augustus continued, ignoring his daughter's look, "owner of the largest pharmacy in Macon and 3 properties in the region. A very respectable family with an excellent reputation. He came here today to meet you properly." Elizabeth felt her stomach turn into tight knots that rose to her throat. Her father was trying to marry her off. He was using the punishment, the confinement, the fear of consequences for Michael's family, all to force her to accept a wealthy and appropriate suitor who would erase any possibility of a relationship with a poor boy from the neighboring ranch. "Sit down, Elizabeth," Augustus ordered, indicating the other armchair next to Dr. Henry. "Let us converse in a civilized manner." But Elizabeth considered refusing, considered turning and running out of that suffocating office, but she knew it would do no good. Her father would lock her in her room again, perhaps for an even longer period. So she sat on the edge of the armchair, back straight, hands clasped in her lap, in a gesture that looked like composure, but was actually extreme tension. The conversation that followed was polite torture. "Doctor." Henry spoke about himself with an inflated ego that left no room for other people to exist in the narrative. He told of his studies in the capital, about how he was the top student in his class, about the complex medical cases he had already solved despite his youth, about the properties his family owned, about his plans to open a private practice in the town near the Sterling estate, about the large house he was having built, 3 stories, with a wraparound porch. Furniture imported from Europe, a grand piano coming from Germany. He talked, and Elizabeth realized he didn't expect her to participate in the conversation. He was just presenting an impressive resume to win approval. Augustus listened, nodding, occasionally asking questions that allowed the doctor to brag even more. He looked at Elizabeth from time to time, with an expression that made it clear he expected her to be impressed, to see in this man the obvious and correct choice. But Elizabeth saw none of that. She saw an arrogant man, full of himself, who spoke of her as if she were a decorative object to be acquired to complement the big house he was building. She saw in his eyes that look some rich men had, a look that evaluated a woman as property, as a status symbol. There was no warmth there, no genuine interest in who she was, in her thoughts, dreams, fears. There was only superficial appreciation of her appearance and cold calculation about how the marriage would benefit his social position. When Dr. Henry finally paused in his litany about himself and asked Elizabeth what she liked to do, she replied with a controlled voice that she liked to read, to embroider, to help needy families. The doctor gave a condescending laugh, said those were charming and suitable occupations for a well-educated young lady, but that when they were married she wouldn't need to worry about needy families anymore. She would have servants to take care of everything, could dedicate her time to being an ornamental wife. When they were married, he already assumed the marriage would happen. Augustus also assumed it, by the way. He nodded, satisfied with the doctor's words. Elizabeth felt anger burning in her chest, anger fighting with fear, with a crushing sense of powerlessness. She wanted to scream that she wouldn't marry that man, that she preferred to die a spinster, that her heart already belonged to another. But the words stayed stuck in her closed throat. Dr. Henry stayed until late afternoon, had tea on the veranda, continued monopolizing the conversation, and finally departed at dusk with a promise to return the following week. He kissed Elizabeth's hand again in farewell, held it for an excessive amount of time, looked into her eyes with a possessive intensity that made her stomach churn. When the doctor's elegant carriage disappeared down the road, kicking up red dust, Augustus turned to Elizabeth with a satisfied expression. "He is a good catch," he declared, as if closing a deal on cattle. "Respectable family, enough money to give you a comfortable life, excellent education. You will marry him, Elizabeth. We will announce the engagement next month. The wedding will be in January after the holidays." Elizabeth finally found her voice. "I will not marry him," she said with a firmness that surprised them both. "I don't love him. I don't even know him properly. I cannot marry someone I don't love." Augustus's expression closed, satisfaction giving way to the familiar coldness. "Love," he repeated with disdain. "Love is a luxury, Elizabeth, not a necessity. Your mother and I were lucky to love each other, but that is the exception, not the rule. Most marriages are based on convenience, on social and financial compatibility, and you will obey because I am your father and I know what is best for you." Elizabeth felt something break inside her at that moment. The obedience she had maintained for years, the fear of displeasing the only parent she had, the respect for his authority. It all cracked like fine porcelain under excessive pressure. "No," she said, and the word came out louder than intended, echoing in the silent study. "I won't marry Dr. Henry, and you can't force me." Augustus took a step toward her, his face turning red with suppressed anger. "I certainly can," he said with a low, dangerous voice. "I am your father and your legal guardian. You will do what I say until you turn 21, and even after, as a single woman, you depend on me. If you do not obey of your own free will, I will make life hell for that boy and his family. I will evict Foreman Sawyer and his son. I will spread word that they are bad workers. I will ensure no ranch in the region hires them. I will destroy that family, Elizabeth. The choice is yours." It was naked blackmail, a threat using innocent people as pawns. Elizabeth looked at her father and saw a stranger for the first time, saw a monster that grief had created, a man who would use any means necessary to maintain absolute control. Tears came, but they were tears of anger more than sadness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked with a trembling voice. "Why do you want to see me unhappy?" Augustus seemed genuinely confused by the question. "I don't want to see you unhappy," he replied, and there was conviction in his voice. "I want to see you safe. I want you to have a stable future, a solid marriage, a comfortable life. That boy cannot give you any of that. He is a foreman's son, Elizabeth. He will spend his life working someone else's land, living in a 3-room shack, struggling to put food on the table. You deserve more than that. You deserve what Dr. Henry can offer." "But what if I prefer a 3-room shack with someone I love over a mansion with someone I can't stand?" Elizabeth retorted. "What if happiness doesn't come from money or social status?" Augustus shook his head, as if dealing with a foolish child who didn't understand the world. "You are young," he said with irritating condescension. You think love is all that matters because you read silly novels. But real life is different. Love fades, Elizabeth. What remains is stability, security, social respect. And I won't let you throw all that away for a passing passion with an unsuitable boy. The conversation ended like that, without resolution. Just two opposing wills clashing without yielding. Augustus made it clear that Dr. Henry would return the following week, and the next, and everyone after, until Elizabeth accepted the inevitable. Elizabeth went up to her room, feeling a crushing weight on her chest, feeling the future closing like an inexorable trap. But something changed that night. Elizabeth was lying in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, dwelling on the conversation with her father, when she heard a light sound at the window. She thought it was a tree branch hitting the glass, pushed by the wind. But the sound came again, more insistent. She got up, walked to the window, opened it, and almost screamed in surprise when she saw a face appearing at the sill. It was Michael. He had scaled the wall, using the thick ivy vines that grew up the side of the house, clinging precariously to the stone ledge 2 stories above the ground. "Eliza," he whispered, and there was desperation mixed with relief in his voice upon seeing her. "I needed to know if you were okay. No one has seen you for weeks. I was worried. I thought your father had hurt you or sent you away." Elizabeth helped him climb in through the window, a difficult and dangerous movement that almost made them fall. When Michael was finally inside the room, the two stood inches apart, breathing hard from both the effort and the sudden proximity. "You're crazy," whispered Elizabeth, but she was smiling for the first time in weeks. "If my father catches you here, he'll kill you." Michael smiled too, that smile that lit up his whole face. "It was worth the risk," he replied with absolute simplicity. "I needed to see you, needed to be sure you were alive and well." The distance between them evaporated. It wasn't a conscious decision by either of them. It was an inevitable magnetism pulling bodies close. Michael raised his hand, touched Elizabeth's face with calloused but surprisingly gentle fingers. Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaned her face into the touch, feeling warmth spreading from the point of contact. When she opened her eyes, he was looking at her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. "I love you," Michael said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, just naked truth. "I know it's madness. I know I have no right. But I love you, Eliza, and I can't pretend it's not true." Elizabeth felt tears come, but they were tears of pure emotion, and not sadness. "I love you too," she whispered, and saying those words out loud for the first time was liberation and commitment simultaneously. Michael pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. Elizabeth sank into the hug, smelling his scent, honest sweat from work mixed with earth and horse, a masculine and comforting smell that made her heart race. They stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other, feeling their hearts beating against one another. Then Michael pulled back slightly, held Elizabeth's face between his large hands, looked into her eyes. "I will find a way," he promised with iron conviction. "I'll save money, I'll buy land, I'll build a house, and when I have something to offer, I'll come for you. Even if your father doesn't approve, even if we have to run away, I won't lose you, Eliza, I swear." They met like this for 3 nights in a row, Michael climbing the wall perilously after the house had fallen asleep, spending precious hours in her room, talking in whispers, planning an impossible future, sustaining each other with promises and dreams. On the 4th night, Elizabeth told him about Dr. Henry Banks, about her father's plans to marry her off in January. She saw anger and pain cross Michael's face, saw his hands curl into tight fists. "I won't let that happen," he said with a hard voice. "We'll run away before then. We'll go to another county, another state if we have to. I'll work anywhere, do anything. But you are not marrying that man." Elizabeth wanted to agree, wanted to say yes immediately, but her father's threat echoed in her head. "If we run, he'll destroy your family," she argued, her voice full of anguish. "He promised to evict your father, spread lies, ensure you can't find work anywhere in the region." Michael remained silent for a long moment, processing. Then he said something that surprised them both. "Then we need to make him understand that he's wrong. We need to show him that this prejudice against me has no foundation. We need to prove that I am capable of taking care of you, that I have worth beyond the station I was born into." Elizabeth wanted to believe it was possible, but she knew her father too well. "He'll never change his mind," she said with despair. "He is so stuck on this idea of social classes, of what is proper or not." Michael looked at her with a strange expression. "Has your father really always been like this?" he asked slowly. "Because my father told me stories about the time he worked here, before I was born. And according to the stories, Colonel Augustus was a different man before your mother died. He was fairer, more open, treated workers with more respect." Elizabeth nodded. "It's true," she confirmed. "He changed completely after Mama died. He became cold, rigid, controlling. I think the grief turned him into a different person." Michael furrowed his brow, thoughtful. "But maybe it wasn't just your mother's death," he suggested hesitantly. "Maybe there's something else in his past that explains why he's so determined to stop you from loving someone of a different class. Something that happened before." Elizabeth had never thought of that. She had always attributed her father's growing rigidity solely to mourning. But what if Michael was right? What if there was something else? Some buried secret that explained his extreme reaction? It was this question that led Elizabeth to seek out Aunt Candida. Mrs. Candida Miller was Julia Sterling's younger sister, 7 years her junior, which placed her now at 42. She lived in Macon with her husband, a prosperous merchant who owned a fine dry goods store. She visited the estate sporadically, 2 or 3 times a year, visits Augustus tolerated because refusing would be a social scandal, but which he clearly did not appreciate. Candida and Augustus never got along well. She had too strong a personality, opinions that were too independent, and a tongue too sharp for his taste. But Candida loved her niece sincerely, tried to maintain contact despite the difficulties, and sent letters that Augustus sometimes intercepted and sometimes allowed Elizabeth to receive, depending on his mood. Elizabeth wrote an urgent letter to her aunt, using stationery she kept in her dresser drawer, writing by candlelight after Michael had left one night. She explained the situation briefly, her love for Michael, her father's plans to marry her to Dr. Henry, the sensation of being cornered. She asked her aunt to come, said she needed help desperately. The next day, when Teresa came to bring lunch, Elizabeth managed to convince the maid to mail the letter secretly. Teresa was a kind woman who clearly sympathized with Elizabeth's situation and agreed to help despite the risks. 7 days later, on a rainy September afternoon, an elegant carriage stopped in front of the manor. And Candida stepped down, wearing a dark blue silk traveling dress and a hat with a veil, holding a parasol to protect herself from the fine drizzle that was falling. Augustus received his sister-in-law with icy politeness, but he could not refuse her entry into the house. Candida demanded to speak with Elizabeth in private, and even Augustus couldn't deny this right without causing a scene. They met in the parlor, door closed, Candida ordering away any servant who tried to linger nearby. The aunt hugged Elizabeth tightly, held her niece's face between her hands, and looked into her eyes. "Tell me everything," she asked with a voice that was gentle but firm. Elizabeth told her, words coming out in a torrent, all the details she had held back for weeks. The love for Michael, her father's punishment, Dr. Henry, the threats, the despair. Candida listened to everything in silence, her expression becoming increasingly serious. When Elizabeth finished, her aunt sighed deeply. "I was afraid something like this would happen," she said with a heavy voice. "Your father is repeating the mistakes of his past. The mistakes he never forgave me for witnessing. Elizabeth blinked, confused. What do you mean? Candida hesitated, clearly debating internally how much to reveal. Then she decided her niece deserved the truth. Your father wasn't always the rigid man you know, she began in a low voice. Before meeting your mother, he was different. Younger, more impulsive, more open, and he was in love, madly in love with a girl from town, the blacksmith's daughter. Her name was Catherine. Elizabeth felt her heart accelerate. She had never heard that name before. Go on, she urged. Candida glanced at the closed door, checking if anyone was listening. Your father was 19. Catherine was 17. They met at a summer harvest dance, began meeting in secret. From what my sister told me later, the love between them was real, intense. Your father wanted to marry her, was willing to face his father, the old Colonel Stephen Sterling, who was a man even more rigid and authoritarian than Augustus is now. If you are enjoying this story, leave your like and share it with someone who needs to believe that true love can overcome any obstacle. But the old colonel discovered the romance, Candida continued, and did exactly what Augustus is doing to you now. He forbade the relationship, locked Augustus on the estate, threatened to destroy the blacksmith's family if the relationship continued, and your father, who was only 19, didn't have the courage to defy his father. He caved. He broke up with Catherine, sent a letter saying it had been a mistake, that she wasn't suitable for him. Catherine was devastated. And it got worse when she discovered, 2 weeks after the breakup, that she was with child. Elizabeth felt the air vanish from her lungs. Pregnant, she repeated weakly. Candida nodded with a somber expression. She was expecting your father's child. She tried to send word to him, but the old colonel intercepted it. He didn't let Augustus know. Catherine tried to deal with it alone, but in a small town like that, pregnancy without marriage was an enormous scandal. Her family kicked her out. She tried to work as a laundress, as a seamstress, anything, but no one wanted to hire a pregnant single woman. The doors closed one by one. What happened to her? Asked Elizabeth, but a part of her already knew, already sensed the tragic ending. Candida wiped away a tear that had escaped. She gave birth alone, in an abandoned shack on the outskirts of town. It was a difficult labor. The baby was born still, the cord wrapped around its neck. And Catherine bled too much. There was no one there to help, to stop the hemorrhage. When they found her the next day, she was already gone. Mother and daughter were buried together in the potter's field, the far corner of the cemetery where they buried people without family or status. Elizabeth was crying now, tears flowing freely down her face. And did Daddy know? Candida nodded. He found out 2 weeks after the funeral. A friend of his told him, someone who had the courage to defy the old colonel's orders. Augustus was destroyed, doesn't adequately describe it. He fell into a deep depression, wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, stayed locked in his room for days. He blamed himself, blamed his father, blamed the world. When he finally came out of that state, he was different. Harder, more controlled. That was when he started working obsessively on the estate, proving to his father that he was a capable man. And my mother? Asked Elizabeth. How was he able to love again after that? Candida smiled sadly. Your mother saved him in a way. Julia met Augustus 2 years after Catherine's death. She saw the pain in him, saw the broken man, and decided to love him anyway. She was patient, she was kind, she was persistent. Little by little, Augustus opened his heart again. Never completely, there was always a part of him that remained closed, but enough to love Julia truly, to build a life with her. Julia knew Catherine's story. I told her when they started courting, thought she deserved to know. And she understood, accepted it. But she also made Augustus promise that he would never let fear and guilt control him, that he would never repeat the mistakes his father had made. But he is repeating exactly the same mistakes, said Elizabeth bitterly. He is doing to me what his father did to him. Exactly, confirmed Candida, and I think it's because the guilt never went away. When Julia died, all those buried emotions returned. The guilt over Catherine, the anger at his father, the fear of losing whom he loves. It all mixed together and turned him into this controlling man who is trying to imprison you to protect you, without realizing he is hurting you the same way he was hurt. Elizabeth wiped her tears, feeling a new determination rising. I need to make him see this, she said. I need to make him understand that he is committing the same error that destroyed 2 innocent lives. I need to make him realize that if he forces me to marry Dr. Henry, he is killing my happiness just as his father killed his. Candida held her niece's hands between her own. I will help you, she promised. I'll stay here a few days. I'll talk to Augustus. I don't guarantee it will work. He is a stubborn man, but at least he will hear the truth he has been avoiding for 20 years. The two spent the rest of the afternoon talking, planning. Candida revealed more details about Augustus's past, about old Colonel Stephen, who ruled with absolute tyranny, about how Augustus suffered under his father's control and was now replicating the same pattern. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in dramatic shades of red and purple, Candida did something surprising. She asked to meet Michael. I want to see with my own eyes the boy who won your heart, she said with a warm smile. I want to judge for myself if he is worthy of you. Elizabeth was nervous but also hopeful. If she could get her aunt's approval, she would have at least one adult ally, someone with social standing who could support the relationship. That night, after the house fell asleep, Michael climbed the wall as he had done on previous nights. But this time, when he entered through the window, he found not just Elizabeth waiting, but also an elegant lady who examined him with scrutinizing but not hostile eyes. Michael froze, clearly thinking he had fallen into a trap. But Elizabeth quickly explained who Candida was and asked him to trust her. Sit down, young man, said Candida, indicating the chair near the window. Let us converse like civilized people. What followed was a gentle but thorough interrogation. Candida asked questions about Michael's family, his education, his plans for the future, his feelings for Elizabeth. Michael answered honestly, without trying to embellish or pretend to be something he wasn't. Yes, he was a foreman's son. No, he had no money. No, he had no land of his own. But he had skills, he had a willingness to work, he had intelligence and honesty. And he loved Elizabeth in a way that was clear in every word, in every glance. Candida observed everything, the way Michael looked at Elizabeth with obvious but respectful adoration, the way Elizabeth looked back with the same intensity, the way the two completed each other despite coming from different worlds. When Michael finally left, descending dangerously down the ivy wall, Candida turned to Elizabeth with a thoughtful expression. He is a good young man, she said finally. He has solid character, works hard, loves you truly. I saw the same thing in his eyes that I used to see in Augustus's eyes when he looked at Julia in those first years. It is real love, Elizabeth, not a fleeting passion of youth. It is something that lasts. Elizabeth felt immense relief flood her chest. Will you help me then? Will you try to make Daddy understand? Candida nodded. I will try, but prepare yourself for resistance. Augustus won't yield easily. Men like him rarely admit they are wrong, especially when it means confronting the painful past they spent decades trying to bury. The next day, Candida requested a private meeting with Augustus. They locked themselves in the study for 3 hours. Elizabeth stayed in the parlor, trying to read but unable to concentrate, listening to the muffled sounds of raised voices coming from the office. Candida was clearly confronting her brother-in-law, forcing him to face truths he preferred to ignore. At one point, Elizabeth heard something break, probably a glass or a vase being thrown. Then heavy, long silence. Finally, the study door opened. Candida walked out looking exhausted but determined. Augustus didn't follow. He stayed inside the office. Candida squeezed Elizabeth's shoulder as she passed. "I planted the seed," she whispered. "Now it needs time to germinate." But time was exactly what they didn't have. 3 days after Candida's visit, Dr. Henry Banks returned, and this time he brought news that accelerated everything. "Colonel Augustus," he said with obvious satisfaction, "I spoke with the priest and reserved the church for the last Saturday of December. We can hold the wedding there, a grand ceremony with all the region's society present. It will be a memorable event." Augustus looked at Elizabeth, who was pale with horror. Then he looked back at the doctor. "We will discuss details later," he said with a careful voice. But there was something different in his expression, some hesitation that didn't exist before. Dr. Henry didn't notice, but Elizabeth did. Candida's words had planted a doubt, small but growing. That night, Elizabeth was at the window waiting for Michael when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room. The door had been unlocked since Candida's visit. Augustus had stopped locking it, a small but significant gesture. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. Elizabeth held her breath. A light knock. Then her father's voice, softer than she had heard in years. "Elizabeth, may I come in?" She said yes, her voice trembling. Augustus entered, stood in the middle of the room, appearing uncomfortable and vulnerable in ways she had never seen. "We need to talk," he said finally. "Really talk, without anger, without ultimatums, about many things I should have told you a long time ago." Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, heart beating fast. Her father pulled up the chair, sat down, and for the first time began to speak about Catherine, about the past that had shaped the present so devastatingly. The conversation between Elizabeth and Augustus that night changed something fundamental between them. Her father spoke for nearly 2 hours, words coming out with increasing difficulty, his voice failing at certain moments when the memories became too heavy. He told her about Catherine with details Candida didn't know, about the young and intense love he had felt, about the plans they had made to run away together, about the cowardice that stopped him from facing his own father. He told her about the day he learned of her death, about how he almost didn't survive, the crushing guilt, about how the memory of that mistake haunted him to this day. "I became my father," admitted Augustus finally, his voice broken with emotion rarely shown. "I swore I would never do to my children what he did to me. Your mother made me promise that. But when she died, when I was left alone with you, fear took over. Fear of losing you like I lost Catherine, like I lost Julia. Fear that if I didn't control you completely, something terrible would happen. And without realizing it, I imprisoned you just as I was imprisoned." Elizabeth had tears streaming silently down her face as she listened. She saw her father not as an authoritarian tyrant, but as a broken man, trying to avoid repeating past tragedies and ending up replicating exactly the same destructive patterns. "Daddy," she said with a soft but firm voice, "I understand your pain. I understand why you are so afraid. But forcing me to marry a man I don't love won't protect me. It will destroy me the same way refusing Catherine destroyed you." Augustus covered his face with his large, calloused hands, shoulders shaking slightly. "I know," he admitted in a muffled voice. "Your aunt made me see that. But it's so hard to let go, Elizabeth. You are all I have left of your mother, of the happy life we had. If I lose you too, there will be nothing left. You won't lose me," promised Elizabeth, kneeling in front of her father's chair, taking his hands between hers. "Marrying Michael doesn't mean you lose me. It means I gain a companion. But you remain my father. You always will be. The difference is that I will be happy. I will have a life of my own. I will be able to love you without resentment, without feeling like I'm suffocating." Augustus looked at her with red, tired eyes. "This young man, Michael," he said slowly, "does he truly love you? Does he treat you well?" Elizabeth nodded with conviction. "He loves me more than any wealth or social position Dr. Henry could offer. He respects me, listens to me, values me, and I love him the same way. It is true love, Daddy, like the love you had for Mama." Augustus remained silent for a long time, an internal battle clearly happening behind his closed expression. Finally, he sighed deeply, a sound of defeat and surrender, but also of relief. "I need to meet him properly," said Augustus finally. "No hidden meetings, no secret romance. If you really want this, it has to be done the right way. He comes here, speaks with me face to face, shows me he's a man of character, as you say, and I will evaluate him with an open mind, more open than I have been." Elizabeth could hardly believe what she was hearing. "That is all I ask," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "a fair chance for him to prove his worth." Augustus nodded. "Send word for him to come tomorrow afternoon. And Elizabeth, one more thing. The wedding to Dr. Henry is cancelled. I will send a letter to him tomorrow explaining there was a mistake, that you are not available. It will cause a scandal. He won't like it. But that is my problem to solve." The next morning, Elizabeth sent a message to Michael through Teresa, who offered to take it to Holy Cross Ranch. Michael arrived promptly at 3 in the afternoon, wearing the best clothes he owned: dark denim trousers without patches, a clean and pressed white shirt, polished boots. His hair was slicked back, he was freshly shaven, and there was a natural dignity in his posture as he walked up to the manner that no fine clothes could buy. Augustus received him in the study, dismissing Elizabeth so they could talk alone. She stayed in the adjacent room, unable to focus on anything, her heart racing as she listened to the muffled murmur of male voices through the closed door. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Augustus asked direct questions about Michael's life, his plans, how he intended to support a wife and eventually a family. Michael answered with an honesty that didn't try to impress, just presented facts. Yes, he was poor, but he had saved every coin he earned, working over the last 6 years, religiously putting away 30% of every paycheck. He had a modest sum, but enough to rent a small piece of land and buy basic tools to start his own horse breeding operation. He would work hard, wake before the sun rose, sleep after dark, do whatever was necessary. He didn't promise wealth or luxury, but he promised honest stability and dedicated love. Augustus heard everything, asked more questions, tested the firmness of the answers. In the end, he found no dishonesty, found no arrogance, found nothing to justify rejection other than the class prejudice he himself was trying to overcome. When the two finally emerged from the study, Elizabeth jumped up, studying their expressions. Michael looked tense but hopeful. Augustus looked exhausted, but lighter than he had in years. "Elizabeth," her father called. "Come here." She approached slowly. Augustus looked at her, then at Michael, then back at her. "This young man has convinced me he has solid character," he said, with a formal but not cold voice. "He convinced me he loves you sincerely and has realistic plans for the future. I cannot deny I would prefer you marry someone of a more established position, someone who could give you immediate comfort. But I learned the hardest way possible that forcing wrong choices causes tragedies. So if this is what you really want, if you are willing to face the difficulties that will come, I will no longer stand in the way." It wasn't an enthusiastic blessing, but it was genuine consent. It was the best she could expect from a man fighting decades of ingrained patterns. Elizabeth felt joy explode in her chest, mixed with relief so intense her legs almost failed. "Thank you, Daddy," she said with a trembling voice. "You won't regret it, I promise." Augustus placed a hand on her shoulder with a gesture that tried to be gentle, despite the stiffness that still remained. "I just want you to be happy," he said, and there was truth in those words, despite the difficulty in expressing them. "It is all your mother wanted too." He turned to Michael. "You have my permission to court Elizabeth properly. No hidden meetings, no nocturnal climbing that I pretended not to notice. You come here, dine with us, talk to her in the parlor under proper supervision until we mark the engagement. That is how it is done correctly." The following weeks were a strange but wonderful period of adjustment. Michael began visiting the Sterling home 3 times a week, always in the late afternoon, always dressed in his best. He dined with Elizabeth and Augustus at the large dining room table that hadn't seen social use in years. The first meals were tense, forced conversations about the weather and crops, uncomfortable silences filling the spaces between forks hitting plates. But gradually, as Augustus observed Michael with increasing attention, he began to recognize qualities he had ignored due to prejudice. He saw the young man's natural intelligence, the way he understood complex concepts about land management, his dedication to work, the genuine respect he demonstrated for both Elizabeth and Augustus himself. It was during one of these dinners, 3 weeks after that first conversation in the study, that something happened which completely changed the dynamic. Augustus was complaining about a persistent problem with the estate's horses, animals that were too skittish, difficult to break, causing accidents with the cowboys who tried to ride them. Michael listened attentively, then hesitated before offering an opinion. "Excuse me, Colonel," he said respectfully, "but may I suggest something?" "You may," replied Augustus, more out of politeness than any real expectation of useful advice. Michael explained a technique he had learned from an old drover who passed through the region years ago, a method of gradual approach that used patience and small rewards instead of brute force. He described the process with details that showed a deep understanding of animal psychology. Augustus listened with growing interest. The next day, he called Michael to help with a particularly problematic horse, a young stallion no one could mount without being thrown. Michael worked with the animal for 2 hours, calm and sure movements, voice low and steady, offering carrots and gentle words, establishing trust gradually. By the end of the session, the horse was eating from his hand and allowing him to touch it without rearing or biting. Augustus watched everything from outside the corral, his expression passing from skepticism to surprise, and finally to genuine respect. "You have a real gift," he said to Michael when the boy left the corral, "a knowledge that most men who work with horses their whole lives don't have. Where did you learn?" Michael explained about the years observing, studying, practicing, about how, since childhood, he was fascinated by animals, how his father taught him the basics, but he had gone further on his own, seeking knowledge wherever he could find it. From that day on, the relationship between Augustus and Michael changed fundamentally. The older rancher began asking the young man's opinion on various farm matters, recognizing genuine expertise. Michael became a regular presence in the Sterling fields, not just as Elizabeth's suitor, but as an informal consultant, helping solve problems, teaching techniques, earning the respect of other workers for his clear skill. Augustus began to see him not as a threat or inappropriate, but as a potentially valuable partner, someone who could eventually help manage the estate's growing operations. The change didn't go unnoticed by the community. Gossip began to circulate about Colonel Augustus Sterling, allowing the neighboring ranch foreman's son to court his only daughter. Some people criticized, saying it was improper, that the colonel was going soft in his old age, that the girl had bewitched her father. But others, especially those who remembered the younger, more open Augustus from before Julia's death, saw it as a return to his better roots, a slow healing of old wounds. Dr. Henry Banks, on the other hand, did not receive the news of the cancellation well. He appeared at Bellevue Estate a week after receiving Augustus's letter, furious and indignant. He demanded explanations, accused Augustus of breaking a gentleman's agreement, insinuated that something improper was happening. Augustus received him in the study with patience that was clearly at its limit. "There was no formal agreement, Dr. Banks," he said with a controlled but firm voice. "There was a presumption on your part and an error of judgment on mine. My daughter does not want to marry you. She loves someone else, and I will not force her into an unhappy marriage." Dr. Henry turned red with anger. "And who is this someone else?" he demanded to know. "Some rich planter from another county, a politician's son?" Augustus hesitated, then decided truth was better than evasion. "It is the son of the foreman from the neighboring ranch. A hard-working, honest young man, whom my daughter chose out of true love." The doctor gave an incredulous and cruel laugh. "A foreman's son?" he repeated with venomous disdain. "You are allowing your daughter to marry a manual laborer. This is a scandal, Colonel. It will destroy your family's reputation. No one in society will respect you after this." Augustus stood up from his chair, his height and bearing imposing natural authority. "A reputation based on keeping a daughter unhappy in a forced marriage is not a reputation I want," he declared, with a conviction that surprised even himself. "And if society cannot accept that character and love matter more than money and position, then it is society that is wrong, not us. Now please remove yourself from my property. This conversation is over." Dr. Henry left, slamming the door with a force that made the painting on the wall tremble. He swore social vengeance, promised to spread scandal, said he would ensure the Sterlings were ostracized by the region's polite society. For a few days, it seemed the threats would materialize. Invitations to social events stopped arriving. Some families who previously visited regularly began to avoid Bellevue Estate. At Sunday service, some high society ladies turned their faces away when Elizabeth and Augustus passed. But then, something happened that changed everything again. It was an October morning, the sky dark with heavy clouds foreshadowing a strong storm. Augustus had gone into town to handle matters at the courthouse, leaving Elizabeth at home. She was on the veranda reading when she heard shouts coming from the direction of the stables. She stood up alarmed, saw black smoke rising. Fire! The main stable was burning. Elizabeth ran there, arrived, and saw a scene of controlled chaos. The workers were trying to get the frightened horses out of the burning building, but the animals were in a panic, rearing and refusing to leave the stalls. The smoke was too dense, the heat too intense. One of the cowboys had suffered a burn on his arm, another had been trampled by a fleeing horse, and there were still 3 animals trapped inside, including the valuable stallion Michael had broken and the pregnant mare that was worth a fortune for her pure lineage. Teresa screamed for someone to fetch help from the neighboring ranch, but everyone knew it would take too long. The horses would die before then. That was when Michael appeared running along the trail that connected the 2 properties. Having seen the smoke from a distance, he assessed the situation in a glance, saw the workers were paralyzed by fear and confusion. He grabbed a wet blanket someone had thrown on the ground, covered his head and shoulders, and without hesitation ran into the burning stable. Elizabeth screamed his name, her heart stopping with pure terror. The seconds that followed were the longest of her life. Smoke poured out the doors and windows in black clouds that blocked visibility. The flames crackled loudly, wood snapping and breaking, part of the roof collapsing with a crash that made everyone recoil. Then Michael emerged from the smoke, guiding the stallion by a makeshift halter, the animal's head covered with a cloth to block the sight of the fire. He handed the horse to a nearby cowboy and turned to go back. "No!" screamed Elizabeth, but he'd already disappeared again into the suffocating smoke. He returned 2 minutes later with the pregnant mare, the animal shaking with fear, but unharmed. Once again he handed it to the workers and made to go back a third time. One of the cowboys tried to stop him, saying it was suicide, that the roof would collapse at any moment. But Michael pushed him aside with iron determination. "There's still a foal inside," he said, his voice raspy from smoke. "I won't let it burn to death." He entered for the third time. The roof partially collapsed right after, with a deafening crash. Elizabeth felt the world stop, felt her legs give way, held up by Teresa, who was also crying in despair. "Pray, child," whispered the maid. "Pray with all the strength you have." It seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then a figure covered in soot and blood stumbled out carrying a young foal in his arms, the animal frightened but alive. Michael took 3 more steps and collapsed to his knees, the foal rolling to the side. Elizabeth ran to him, followed by other workers. Michael was coughing violently, his body convulsing, trying to expel the smoke he had inhaled. He had an ugly burn on his left forearm where a flaming beam had fallen, blood running from a cut on his forehead, clothes partially burned and smoking. If this story is touching your heart, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and share with those you love. They took Michael into the manor, laid him on the bed in the guest room. Elizabeth cleaned his wounds with water and clean cloths, hands shaking but steady out of necessity. She applied an herbal salve her mother had taught her for burns, bandaged him with meticulous care. Michael drifted in and out of consciousness, feverish from smoke inhalation and shock. Elizabeth stayed by his side the entire night, holding his hand, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, whispering that he was going to be okay, that he had been a hero, that she loved him more than anything. When Augustus returned from town in the late afternoon and learned what had happened, he went straight to the room where Michael was. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the unconscious boy who had risked his life 3 times to save property that wasn't even his. Then he turned to Elizabeth with an expression she had never seen before, a complex mixture of gratitude, respect, and something akin to shame. "This boy has more courage and honor than 10 rich men," Augustus said with a hoarse voice. "He saved 3 animals worth over $2,000 combined. But more than that, he showed character that is priceless. Elizabeth, I was wrong, completely wrong about him, about what truly matters, about everything." Elizabeth felt tears running down. "You are realizing now what I always knew," she said softly, "that a man's worth isn't measured by money or last name. It is measured by actions, by character, by heart." Augustus nodded slowly, still looking at Michael. "When he wakes up, when he is recovered," said the rancher with firm decision, "I will make him a proposal. I will offer a piece of land here on the estate, 50 acres in the north section where the soil is good but currently unused. He can build a house there, start the horse breeding operation he always wanted. In exchange, he works as a permanent partner overseeing my stock, teaching me his techniques. It is a partnership, not charity. A fair deal where both sides win." Elizabeth could hardly believe what she was hearing. It was more than she had dared to hope. It was genuine generosity from her father that came not from obligation, but from earned respect. Michael woke up the next day, weak and sore, but conscious. When Augustus made the proposal, the young man initially tried to refuse, saying it was too much, that he couldn't accept charity. "It isn't charity," insisted Augustus firmly. "It is a smart business move on my part. You have skills I need. I have land you need. We work together, both come out ahead. And more importantly, Elizabeth wins, because she will have a husband with the means to support her with dignity." Michael looked at Elizabeth, saw hope shining in her eyes, and finally agreed. "Thank you, Colonel," he said, voice choked up. "I swear I will honor this trust. I will work harder than any man you have ever seen, and I will take care of your daughter like the most precious treasure I have." News of Michael's heroism spread through the region faster than the fire he had fought. The same people who had criticized the unlikely romance began to change their opinion. After all, a man who risks his life 3 times to save animals, even when they are someone else's property, demonstrates exceptional character that transcends social standing. The story was embellished with every retelling, as stories tend to be. They said Michael had walked into a literal hell, that the flames had closed behind him, that only superhuman willpower allowed him to survive. They said the animals he saved were the most valuable in the entire region, that the loss would have ruined Colonel Augustus if not for the boy's courage. The official engagement was announced 3 weeks later, when Michael was completely recovered from his burns. It was a small but warm party at the manor, with the closest neighbors, workers from both farms, and Aunt Candida, who came especially for the occasion. Candida hugged Augustus for a long time, whispered in his ear that her sister would be proud, that he had finally broken the cycle of pain. Augustus had tears in his eyes when he pulled away, but they were tears of relief and not sadness. The wedding was set for January, as Dr. Henry had originally suggested, but for completely different reasons. Michael spent the following months building a house on the land Augustus had given, a simple but solid 3-room structure, with a small porch, a well-planned corral for the horses, a deep well with clean water. He worked from sunup to sundown, assisted by other workers who respected him for the courage shown, building a future with his own hands. Elizabeth visited frequently, always accompanied by Teresa to maintain social propriety, watching the house take shape, imagining the life they would live there. It was a humble house compared to the mansion where she grew up, but it was a house built with love and honest sweat, and that made it more beautiful than any palace. She embroidered linens, sewed curtains, prepared for the role of a wife in a very different way than she would have as the mistress of Dr. Henry's big house. There wouldn't be servants for everything, there wouldn't be imported luxuries. But there would be true love, there would be real partnership, there would be the freedom to be herself without masks or imposed roles. The wedding took place on a cold but sunny morning on January 15, 1898, in the same main church where Elizabeth's parents had married 20 years earlier. Elizabeth wore a simple but lovely wedding dress that Aunt Candida had helped make, white satin with delicate lace, a tulle veil held by fresh wildflowers. Michael wore a borrowed suit that Augustus had ordered tailored. He was nervous but radiant. The church was surprisingly full. Workers from both farms came en masse. Humble families Elizabeth had helped over the years showed up to return the kindness. And even some members of high society who had initially criticized appeared, curiosity overcoming prejudice. Augustus walked his daughter down the central aisle of the church, his steps slow and careful. When they reached the altar where Michael waited, the rancher held Elizabeth's hand, then took Michael's hand and joined the two. "Take good care of her," he said with a voice strong enough for the whole church to hear. "She is the most precious treasure I have, and you, son, have proven to be a man worthy of her. I am proud to entrust my daughter to your care." They were words that cost decades of pain to say, but they came out with absolute truth. The ceremony was beautiful and emotional. Father Augustus, the priest, officiated with a sincerity that was previously lacking, perhaps moved by the story of redemption everyone knew. When he pronounced them husband and wife, when Michael kissed Elizabeth with tenderness and reverence, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. The reception was at Bellevue Estate, but unlike any party those walls had seen, it wasn't a formal and rigid high society event. It was a genuine celebration, with simple but plentiful food, music played by local fiddlers, spontaneous dancing, loud and sincere laughter. Augustus circulated among the guests, talking to workers he previously barely noticed, accepting congratulations from people of all social classes, demonstrating an openness that shocked those who knew him only as the rigid colonel. At one point, he sat next to Mr. Frank Sawyer, Michael's father, and the two men talked at length about sons, about pride, about how sometimes the next generation teaches lessons the previous generation needs to learn. Elizabeth and Michael spent their first night as a couple in the new house he had built. It was a night with a full moon illuminating the fields with pale silver, creating soft and romantic shadows. The house was simple but clean, a new bed with sheets Elizabeth had embroidered, curtains she had sewn swaying gently in the warm breeze entering through the open window. Lying together for the first time legitimately, entwined in each other's arms, they talked about dreams and plans. Michael spoke about the first horses he would buy with the money he had saved, about techniques he wanted to try, about the reputation he would build little by little. Elizabeth spoke about continuing to help needy families, about teaching children to read, about planting a garden around the house with roses, as her mother had done. The months that followed were of hard work, but deeply satisfying. Michael established a horse breeding operation that quickly gained a reputation for the exceptional quality of the animals. Ranchers from distant counties began to come to him, wanting to buy horses trained by his unique techniques. The small property began to prosper in a modest but steady way. Elizabeth divided her time between caring for the house, helping Michael with the administrative side of the business, and continuing the charity work she always did. But now she did it with true freedom, not as an escape valve from a gilded cage, but as the genuine choice of someone who has purpose. The relationship between Elizabeth and Augustus also transformed. Her father visited regularly, always giving notice beforehand so as not to invade the couple's privacy, but he came with increasing frequency. He brought practical gifts, tools for Michael, fabrics for Elizabeth, groceries when he knew money was tight in the first months. But more importantly, he brought genuine presence, participation in his daughter's life that went beyond control or suffocating protection. He dined at the simple table of the cottage, talked about various subjects, laughed at jokes Michael told, demonstrated affection that had been buried for years under layers of fear and guilt. It was during one of these visits, 6 months after the wedding, that Elizabeth gave the news that would change everything again. "Daddy," she said with a radiant smile that lit up her entire face, "you are going to be a grandfather. I am 3 months pregnant." Augustus stood paralyzed for a moment, eyes wide, mouth open. Then tears began to roll down his hardened face, tears he didn't try to hide or wipe away. He stood up slowly, pulled Elizabeth into a tight hug that lasted a long time. "Your mother would be so happy," he whispered with a broken voice. "So proud of you, of the woman you became, of the family you are building. And I am too, Elizabeth, more proud than I can express. Forgive me for almost destroying all this happiness because of my foolish fears." Elizabeth squeezed her father back, feeling a circle closing, wounds healing, destructive patterns finally being broken. "There is nothing to forgive, Daddy," she said sincerely. "You were afraid. You were trying to protect me the only way you knew how. But you learned, you changed, you grew, and that is all that matters." The child was born in February of 1899, a healthy and strong girl named Julia, in honor of the grandmother she would never meet, but whose legacy of kindness and love would live through her. Augustus held his granddaughter for the first time, with hands trembling with emotion, looked at that small, perfect face, and felt something heal inside him definitively. It was a chance to get it right, to love without fear, to be present without suffocating. The years passed, bringing gradual but profound changes. Michael's horse breeding prospered to the point where he could buy more adjacent land, expand operations, employ 2 hands. Elizabeth had 2 more children, a boy named Augustus in honor of his grandfather, and another girl they called Catherine, a name Augustus suggested with a voice full of meaning. It was a way to honor the memory of the girl he had loved and lost, to acknowledge that that old tragedy had finally found redemption through his daughter's courage to fight for her own love. Augustus changed in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. He opened Bellevue Estate for community events, summer festivals where everyone was welcome regardless of social class. He began to treat workers with more respect and fairness, improving wages and housing conditions, transforming into an admired employer rather than just a feared one. He established a fund to help workers' families going through difficulties, Catherine's memory and his own past, motivating a generosity that was previously lacking. He became close to his grandchildren in a way he had never managed to be close to his own daughter when she was a child, present but not controlling, loving but not suffocating, finally learning the balance that had been missing. The story of the love between Elizabeth and Michael became a legend in the region, told and retold with variations and embellishments. They said it was proof that true love conquers any obstacle, that character matters more than money, that second chances exist even after terrible mistakes. Young couples used it as an example when facing family opposition, pointing out that even the rigid Colonel Augustus Sterling had eventually yielded when confronted with genuine love and true courage. His transformation from controlling tyrant to loving grandfather and fair boss was studied as an example that people can change, that it is never too late to break destructive patterns and choose a better path. 10 years after the wedding, on a golden August afternoon, very similar to the one when Elizabeth and Michael met in the barn for the first time, the entire family was gathered on the porch of the house Michael had built, and which had been expanded over the years. Elizabeth was sitting in the rocking chair her husband had made for her, little Julia in her arms, now 9 years old and reading a book aloud to her younger siblings. Michael was beside her, hand resting on his wife's shoulder, looking with satisfaction at the prosperous property stretching around them. Augustus was sitting in the other rocking chair, 5-year-old Catherine on his lap, telling a story about her grandmother, who had the same name, about how she was kind and brave, about how she left a legacy of love that continued living through the generations. The sun descended slowly, painting the sky in impossible shades of pink, orange, purple and gold, illuminating the rolling fields that had witnessed so much suffering, but also so much redemption. Horses grazed peacefully in well-tended pastures, their coats shining in the golden evening light. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, bringing the smell of dinner being prepared. The sound of children's laughter echoed, mixing with the song of birds settling in for the night and the soft wind whispering through the trees. It was a scene of perfect peace, of a united family, of happiness achieved through courage and love. Elizabeth looked at her husband, saw his hair starting to show the first silver strands at the temples, fine lines around his eyes from years of smiling and working under the sun. She looked at her father, saw how he had aged, but also how he had softened. Hardness giving way to kindness, fear giving way to trust. She looked at her children, seeing the future unfolding in the infinite possibilities they represented. She felt a deep and overwhelming gratitude flood her chest, gratitude for having had the courage to follow her heart, for having fought for what she believed in, for having refused to accept a gilded cage even when it seemed safer. Her heart had chosen Michael in that first meeting in the barn 11 years ago, an instant and inexplicable choice that time only confirmed and deepened. And that choice, faced against all odds and obstacles, had not only created happiness for the two of them, but had transformed entire families, healed generational wounds, broken destructive patterns that had been repeating for decades. It had proved that true love is not a frivolous luxury, but a transformative force capable of changing the hardest hearts, of bringing light to the darkest places, of building futures where before there were only prisons. And when the last light of the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains and the first stars began to appear in the gradually darkening sky, when Michael lit a lantern on the porch, creating a welcoming circle of golden light, that kept the darkness at bay. When the children snuggled closer to the adults seeking warmth and safety, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. That the 3-room cottage that had grown to 6 was worth more than any mansion. That love won through struggle and sacrifice was more precious than any comfort given without effort. That the freedom to choose one's own path, even when difficult, was more valuable than a gilded cage, however comfortable it might be. And looking at her father, holding his granddaughter with a tenderness he had almost lost forever, seeing a genuine smile illuminating his previously always somber face, Elizabeth understood that the victory was not just hers. It was his too. It was the victory of a man who had found the courage to confront a painful past, to admit mistakes, to change ingrained patterns even when it seemed impossible. It was a victory of love over fear, of hope over despair, of second chances over past tragedies. It was living proof that it is never too late to choose a different path, to break invisible chains that bind us, to let the heart lead even when the head screams danger. And on that quiet night, under ancient stars witnessing one more generation of human stories, the family gathered on the simple porch full of love was a silent testament that some battles are worth every pain, every struggle, every risk, because in the end, it is love that remains, it is love that transforms, it is love that redeems.